Every painter is unique and distinguished from others by their drawing style, the subjects they handle, and their composition. But somehow, there are some who take this freedom to a different level and become one of the first names that come to mind when we say painter. Vincent van Gogh is such a painter that even someone who is completely removed from art, someone who says, "Art doesn't interest me, it doesn't appeal to me," can be affected by his works. Van Gogh was 27 years old when he decided to become a painter. What's worse, his career, which began at a relatively late age, ended with his death at 37. And in this short art career of barely 10 years, he produces works that leave us stunned. Most people know him for his struggle with mental illness, cutting off his ear, and his controversial suicide. But Van Gogh's real subject is the art he practiced, rather than his personal life. He first tried his luck in different professions. He tried working as an art dealer, but things didn't go as expected. He wanted to become a preacher, but failed. He couldn't hold on to various jobs. Finally, he decided to become a painter, and his greatest supporter throughout this process was his younger brother Theo. Theo discussed art with his brother, interpreted his brother's art, and gave him advice. The two corresponded for a long time. In one of the letters Vincent wrote to his brother Theo, he gave information about his first major work. In the letter, "I believe there is life in it." And indeed, he was right. There was life in his work. Van Gogh had a particular fascination with peasants. In these paintings, the noble aspect of the peasant's struggle for life comes to the fore. Van Gogh knew that becoming a great artist was not an easy process. It required patience. That is why he was so moved by the struggles of working people. Because the dedication and determination these people showed in their work were qualities Van Gogh sought in himself. He said, "The fact that my drawings are not yet what I want them to be is a constant source of disappointment for me. The difficulties are truly varied and great. They cannot be overcome in an instant. Progress is like a miner's work. It does not advance at the expected or desired pace. However, when faced with such a task, the fundamental requirements are patience and loyalty. Actually, I don't think too much about the difficulties, because if you think too much about them, you either become numb or uncomfortable." The determination and perseverance displayed in activities such as plowing, sowing seeds, and harvesting had captivated Van Gogh. In fact, Van Gogh became so engrossed in this peasant life that at one point he even aspired to become a peasant painter. Peasant people, housework, childcare, sewing, farm work, almost everything related to village life can be found in his peasant character studies. Vincent loved this village scene so much that he invited his brother to join him in rural life. "Theo, become a painter, try to save yourself, and come to the countryside. Come and paint potatoes in the fields with me, walk behind the plow and the shepherd, sit with me and watch the fire in the countryside. Let the storm blow through you too." Vincent wrote his letters in a sincere and captivating style. He had a very fluid writing style. If he hadn't been a painter, I think he could have been a writer. His relationship with his brother Theo, with whom he corresponded, was very special. Moreover, Theo's advice also influenced Vincent's art. In one of these letters, Theo asks Vincent to reduce the dark tones in his works and use vibrant colors. If we look at Van Gogh's paintings from that period, we can easily see that he used much darker and gloomier tones compared to his later works. After Vincent began to heed his brother's advice, he started to paint more colorful, more vibrant pictures, and this change in his art opened a new chapter in his career. As Van Gogh began to use more vibrant colors, he began to love one color in particular: yellow. We can see these yellow tones in many of his works: yellow fields, yellow skies. Even in the works where he painted himself, human skin appears yellow, disrupting all naturalness. To be more specific, he loved the contrast between yellow and blue. He often used these two colors together. Now, we have mentioned that Van Gogh loved both using the color yellow and painting village life. So, where is the place that best meets these two criteria for such an artist? This was village life. He painted wheat fields for almost his entire career. He was fascinated by nature. He always tried to capture the connection between plants in nature and human life. He would say, "When we think about all the things we don't understand, what else can we do but look at a wheat field? The history of these plants is like ours. We who are fed by bread, aren't we very much like wheat? And just like them, won't we be harvested when we mature? In this video, we also have the opportunity to observe the impasto technique used by Van Gogh. In the impasto technique, brushstrokes are thick and pronounced. For example, we can see these thick and pronounced brushstrokes in Van Gogh's work, Wheat Field with Crows. Another example of Van Gogh's passion for yellow is his sunflowers. However, he did not stop at sunflowers. He also painted other flowers such as roses, lilacs, and irises. Although flowers are depicted in vivid colors in Van Gogh's works, if we look closely at the details, we can also see wilted flowers in the composition. Anyone looking at these works can perceive both beauty and vitality, as well as become aware of death. As Van Gogh stated in Wheat, flowers also have a life cycle, and wilting does not mean the end for a flower. Even if a flower wilts, its seeds can give life to new flowers. Van Gogh particularly loved painting sunflowers. Yellow is an energizing color, the color of the sun, a color close to the joy of life. But red isn't exactly a cheerful color. Red evokes a sense of danger and threat. Van Gogh succeeds in creating a tense atmosphere by using this red in one of his works, Cafe at Night. "It's one of the ugliest paintings I've ever made," Van Gogh said. In fact, he had gone to a real cafe and sketched the painting there. In another letter, he provided the following details about the cafe he painted. "There are places here called cafés de nuit. They're quite common around here. They stay open all night. Night vagabonds can take refuge here when they've run out of money for lodging or are too drunk to get into anywhere else. It can't be said that the night cafe is a respectable place. It might be a haunt for the homeless, the drunk, and the wretched. And when you bring together people who have nothing left to lose, all sorts of dangers can be expected." In my Night Cafe series, I tried to show that a cafe can be a place that destroys a person, drives them mad, and even leads them to commit a crime. Van Gogh intentionally sought to create an unsettling feeling in this work, and the color red reinforces that feeling. It's not just the red. The harsh contrast between red and green also heightens the tension. In fact, even the figure's hair and mustache, which are looking directly at us, are green, despite the red hues in the background. The perspective is also peculiar. It feels as though we are inside a warped space that defies the laws of physics. Let's return to Van Gogh's personal life. At one point in his life, Van Gogh befriended a man named Paul Gauguin, who was also a painter. However, the relationship between the two was peculiar. Gauguin was a more experienced painter than Van Gogh. Van Gogh wanted to learn about art from Gauguin, and since he had very few friends, he valued having a friend by his side. But there was a problem. Neither of them was exactly a normal person. Both had impulsive personalities. Van Gogh suffered from mental illness, was an alcoholic, and was someone who experienced occasional episodes. On the other hand, Gauguin was someone who displayed a haughty and condescending attitude. Van Gogh was generally bothered by this attitude, but at the same time, he didn't want to end his friendship with Gauguin. In fact, he secretly feared that Gauguin would abandon him. In truth, he was afraid of being alone. Naturally, the two argued frequently. However, one of these arguments led to the infamous ear-cutting incident. While arguing with Gauguin, Van Gogh lost control to such an extent that, following the outburst, he cut off his own ear. Van Gogh, who was later taken to the hospital, had completely severed his left ear, according to the doctor's report. Van Gogh later painted a portrait of this doctor as well. There is another absurd detail in this painting that catches our attention. For some unknown reason, Vincent chose to paint the doctor's ear red. Van Gogh did not stop at painting the doctor. He also painted a self-portrait of himself with a bandaged, severed ear. He had painted himself in many different states throughout his career. Painting himself with a bandage was inevitable. Now let's talk about Van Gogh's interest in Japanese art. Van Gogh was a great admirer of Japanese art. Western artists had been introduced to Japanese art in the 1860s with the acceleration of overseas trade and had fallen under its spell. With its exotic colors, distinctive drawing style, and unique approach to perspective, Japanese art had virtually enchanted the West. Two aspects of Japanese art particularly influenced Van Gogh: the creativity in the use of color and the emphasis on nature. Van Gogh's art already reflected a sensitivity to color and nature. Additionally, a distinctive sense of joy pervaded Japanese art. It possessed a unique charm. Vincent created copies inspired by some of these works. One of them was the figure on the cover of a special issue of an art magazine dedicated to Japanese art. Of course, these were not exact copies. Van Gogh's color tones were more pronounced. We also see the influence of Japanese art in a portrait of an art dealer with a background filled with Japanese works, or in his depictions of almond blossoms. The influence of Japanese art is even present in his painting titled Bedroom. In his letters, he noted that, unlike in Japanese art, he did not use shadows in this work and preferred a flat perspective. Therefore, even in a work where we might not immediately notice the Japanese influence, the impact of Japanese art lies beneath the surface. One of the elements that drew Van Gogh to Japanese art was this extraordinary use of color. Van Gogh was an artist who loved to experiment with colors. He had a deep understanding of color theory and frequently used complementary colors in particular. He used the contrasts created by red-green, blue-yellow, and yellow-purple color combinations, knowing that they made each other stand out more clearly. From portraits to landscape paintings, it is precisely these color choices that play a role in the distinct and dynamic nature of his works, which captivate everyone. Let's return to the infamous ear-cutting incident, because after this event, Van Gogh's life would never be the same again. As a result of the constant crises he experienced, Van Gogh was admitted to a mental hospital. The St. Paul de Mossel mental hospital where Van Gogh stayed was a peaceful and quite modern place nestled in nature. The authorities allowed Van Gogh to paint and even assigned him a room he could use as a studio. Van Gogh's extraordinary productivity during his time there is also noteworthy. In just 1 year at this hospital, he produced nearly 150 works. Of course, the fact that Van Gogh was at this mental hospital with its beautiful views overlooking the courtyard, and the works he painted while looking out the windows, were special in their own right. Van Gogh painted The Starry Night, one of his most famous works, while he was in a mental hospital. This painting depicts the view from the window of his hospital room. However, interestingly, the painting shows a village that is not normally part of the landscape. Van Gogh usually painted by looking at the landscape. However, Gauguin had encouraged Vincent to paint using his imagination rather than looking at the landscape. Perhaps following Gauguin's advice, he added a village to the landscape he saw. The artist said the following about this work: "This morning, long before the sun rose, I saw the rural landscape from my window." The painting appears to have an animated effect, and perhaps due to this painting style, Starry Night has become one of Van Gogh's most frequently adapted works into animation. There was only the morning star, and it looked very large. So, was the thing Van Gogh saw as so large actually a star? Researchers have noted that around the time this painting was created, the planet Venus appeared brighter than usual, so bright, in fact, that it could be seen with the naked eye. Given this, Van Gogh may have painted the exceptionally bright planet Venus. Even after being released from the mental hospital, Van Gogh's life never returned to normal. He worked tirelessly but neglected his own well-being. Even in the letters he wrote, he noted that his condition was steadily worsening. "My life is being shaken to its core, and my steps are faltering." Van Gogh took his own life at the age of 37 by shooting himself. What remained of him were the unique works he created during his 10-year career and the letters he wrote. The saddest part was that he had written these words about himself in a letter. "What am I in the eyes of most people? A nobody, a strange character, or an unpleasant person, someone who has no place in society and never will." Well, even if that were entirely true, then one day I would like to show, through my works, what lies in the heart of such a strange character, of such a nobody. This is my ambition. Despite everything, it is rooted not in hatred but in love, not in passion but in serenity. I often feel that even in the deepest misery, there is still a calm, pure harmony and music. And even in the poorest shacks, in the dirtiest corners, I see drawings and paintings. And my mind is drawn to these things with an irresistible force. The main reason we have such a wealth of information today about Vincent is Theo. Theo carefully preserved every letter he received from Vincent. Unfortunately, shortly after Vincent's death, Theo also passed away due to an illness. Van Gogh's works were later entrusted to Theo's wife. Theo had wanted the works to reach the public, but he did not live long enough to see this happen. And so, this task fell to Theo's wife. She organized exhibitions in Van Gogh's name through numerous organizations and also helped establish his reputation by making the letters Theo had preserved available to the public. Now let's return to Vincent. There is a concept known as the suffering artist. In fact, this concept implies the claim that an artist must suffer in order to be more productive. While figures like Van Gogh are often cited as examples of this concept, this is not the case with Van Gogh. Yes, he had a mental illness, but this illness, these sufferings, did not help Van Gogh's art. On the contrary, they hindered his ability to create. Thinking this way would be a great injustice to his efforts, because what helped him was that he was happy, very hardworking, and equally determined. If you recall from the beginning of the video, Van Gogh compared his artistic journey to the work of a laborer, a farmer, or a miner. He saw it as a process requiring finesse, patience, and perseverance. He was, in a way, using art to battle this mental illness. The mental illness wasn't fueling his art. Rather, he was overcoming it through art. If there's a message to be drawn from this entire process, it is the healing power of art. He continued to create these beautiful works until his very last breath.